There is a psychological truth that Carl Jung discovered by studying thousands of clinical cases, one that completely changes the way we understand the power of detachment in human relationships. When a person pulls away emotionally from someone who desires them intensely, something specific always happens that goes beyond simple behavioral strategy and touches the depths of the unconscious in ways the rational mind cannot fully comprehend. Your detachment is haunting her more than 1,000 words of love, more than 1,000 elaborate promises, more than 1,000 desperate attempts to win her back through logical arguments. This does not happen by chance or by a whim of fate, but through a precise psychological mechanism that Jung called the projection of the shadow, which activates automatically when someone we desire intensely suddenly becomes unreachable. This video does not exist to feed superficial psychological games or manipulative strategies from a cheap seduction manual, but to show you the deep unconscious mechanism that activates when a person loses what they believed they could control or emotionally possess. If you have ever noticed how someone who was completely ignoring you suddenly began to seek you out at the exact moment you stopped chasing them, if you have lived through that strange dynamic where the more you pull away, the more the other person seems obsessed with your presence, then you are about to understand something fundamental about the nature of human attachment, according to Jungian depth psychology. If you have experienced the paradoxical power of eloquent silence, when your words served absolutely no purpose but your meaningful absence said everything, if you have discovered that authentic detachment has more persuasive force than any perfectly constructed logical argument, you are in the right place to understand why this happens at the deep unconscious level. Jung warned repeatedly that the human unconscious operates according to principles completely opposite to those of rational logic, and when someone we desire pulls away emotionally, our psyche automatically interprets this detachment as an existential threat that must be resolved at all costs, through mechanisms of projection, idealization, and what Jung called the inflation of the wounded ego. This is not just any content you will find everywhere on the internet. It is the scientific explanation of what many call reverse psychology, but which is in reality something far more complex, profound, and transformative than we can imagine with our limited conscious mind. If you leave before the end, you will miss the most important part of the message, the part that explains why authentic detachment has such a devastating power over the human psyche, and how to distinguish it from the cold, calculated manipulation that damages relationships. The difference does not lie in outward behavioral techniques or studied communication strategies, but in something that happens in the depths of being that not even we ourselves can always consciously control. If something in this already resonates deeply within you, like a psychological truth you knew but couldn't rationally explain, subscribe to the channel and write detachment in the comments, so that the YouTube algorithm understands that this reflection deserves to reach those who truly need it at this moment of their personal evolution. Because when you understand Jung's law of the unconscious power of detachment, you don't only change the way you handle complicated romantic relationships, you change the way you recognize your own worth, reflected in the eyes of those who seek you desperately when you are no longer emotionally available. Listen with the utmost attention, because here a very widespread fantasy about the power of words is broken, one we all believe we know but have in reality never truly understood at a deep level. It is not passionate, detailed declarations of love that conquer the heart. It is not elaborate promises or grand romantic gestures. It is not even the most convincing and well-structured logical arguments. It is the eloquent silence that speaks on its own, the meaningful absence that creates emptiness, the detachment that speaks directly to the unconscious without passing through the filters of the rational mind that continuously analyzes and judges. When a person pulls away emotionally from someone who desires them intensely, their unconscious communicates an extremely powerful message that Jung called the affirmation of personal worth through perceived scarcity. The other person's unconscious automatically receives this unconscious signal and interprets it as irrefutable proof that this person possesses something precious and unreachable that is worth conquering at any possible cost. I want to make this concrete with a real case I personally followed in counseling to help you understand exactly what we mean when we speak of the unconscious power of authentic detachment. Julia, a 32-year-old woman, extremely communicative and expressive, who firmly believed in the power of words and of open, honest communication, told me about a situation that completely changed her perspective on human relational dynamics. She had spent entire months trying to convince Marco, a man she was deeply interested in, through intense and profound conversations, elaborate messages, and thoughtful gestures that clearly demonstrated her authentic feelings. The more she strove to verbally communicate her genuine interest, the more he seemed distant and elusive, as if her words had exactly the opposite effect to the one her heart desired. One particular day, tired and disappointed by this frustrating and painful dynamic, Julia made a radical decision that changed everything in ways she could never have imagined. She completely stopped seeking Marco out in every possible way, stopped replying immediately to his sporadic and unengaging messages, stopped always being available when he needed something or sought attention. Not out of cold, calculated strategy or angry revenge, but out of authentic, deep emotional exhaustion and an urgent need to protect her wounded dignity and her psychological balance. What Julia did not know at that crucial moment of her personal evolution is that she was activating what Jung defined with scientific precision as the projection of the shadow through conscious detachment. The shadow, in complex Jungian psychology, represents everything a person does not want to acknowledge about themselves, including their hidden vulnerability, their deep need for authentic love, and their paralyzing fear of emotional abandonment. When Julia pulled away emotionally with authenticity, Marco began unconsciously to project onto her all the precious qualities he had always denied wanting in an ideal woman. Her genuine emotional independence suddenly became irresistible and magnetic. Her natural ability to live fully without him became an existential challenge that his male ego absolutely could not passively accept. Her physical and emotional absence became, paradoxically, more present and haunting than any of her previous physical presence could ever have been. It is not unhealthy psychological manipulation or a destructive neurotic power game. It is a natural mechanism of the collective unconscious that Jung observed repeatedly in his most complex patients. When something becomes scarce or unreachable in our perception, the human psyche automatically attributes a superior and precious value to it, regardless of its real, measurable objective value. Julia's authentic detachment communicated to Marco something fundamental that no elaborate words could ever have conveyed with the same direct effectiveness. It told him without explicitly saying so that she had a full and meaningful life even without him, that her intrinsic worth as a person did not depend on his approval or superficial interest, that she was complete in herself and had no desperate need of anyone to feel fulfilled as a human being. This powerful unconscious message struck Marco far more deeply than any explicit, detailed declaration of love because it directly touched his primitive instinct of conquest and his unconscious need to feel special to someone who did not need him. Jung clearly explained that the male unconscious is particularly sensitive to the challenge represented by an emotionally independent and complete woman who does not chase him desperately seeking external validation. Effective detachment, according to Jung, is not strategic calculated coldness or fake indifference masking repressed anger and deep resentment. It is an authentic state of self-centeredness, born from the deep awareness of one's own intrinsic worth as a complete human being. When this detachment is genuine and not acted out, it automatically communicates inner security, developed emotional maturity, and that magnetic quality that Jung called advanced psychological individuation. Jungian individuation represents the complex process through which a person becomes completely themselves, integrates all the parts of their fragmented personality, and stops seeking in others what they can find only within themselves. When someone reaches this elevated level of psychological maturity, their detachment is not a manipulative strategy to obtain external attention, but a natural consequence of the inner completeness they have attained. Marco began to seek Julia out with an emotional intensity he had never shown before in any relationship, not because she was using studied manipulation techniques, but because her authentic detachment had activated in him what Jung called the process of forced individuation through crisis. Suddenly, he painfully realized that he had taken a person of exceptional worth for granted and had lost something precious and unique due to his chronic inability to recognize its real importance. The power of detachment works perfectly at the psychological level because the human unconscious is evolutionarily programmed to intensely desire what it cannot easily have and to automatically undervalue what is always available, without effort. This is not cynicism about imperfect human nature, but a simple, observable psychological reality that Jung documented constantly in his in-depth clinical studies of thousands of patients. When Julia stopped being emotionally available for Marco, he suddenly began to clearly notice all the unique qualities he had always unconsciously ignored or minimized. Her sharp intelligence became fascinating and stimulating. Her emotional independence became seductive and desirable. Her natural ability to be happy without him became an irresistible challenge that his wounded male ego could not passively accept. Jung warned repeatedly that this unconscious mechanism works only when the detachment is completely authentic and not a calculated performance to obtain specific predictable results. The other person's deep unconscious immediately and instinctively perceives the crucial difference between genuine detachment born from one's own inner completeness and fake detachment born from conscious manipulation or repressed revenge that seeks punishment. Authentic detachment unconsciously communicates that this person has real, multiple options, has a rich and meaningful life full of purpose, has high standards of quality, and does not easily settle for mediocre relationships or for people who fail to recognize their unique worth. This powerful unconscious message is infinitely more persuasive than any explicit verbal declaration because it completely bypasses the critical rational mind and speaks directly to the deepest primitive instincts. Marco confessed sincerely to me during a therapy session that in the months when Julia was actively seeking him out, he felt unconsciously superior and in total control of the relational situation. His ego was flattered by the constant attention, but not stimulated by an evolutionary challenge. When she pulled away emotionally with authenticity, he suddenly felt vulnerable and uncertain, forced to confront the real and painful possibility of losing her forever. This forced vulnerability activated in Marco what Jung called the process of integration of the shadow through conscious suffering. He was painfully forced to acknowledge parts of himself he had always strenuously denied, including his deep need for authentic love and his paralyzing fear of abandonment, masked as superficial independence. Julia's detachment did not cruelly punish him or cynically manipulate him, but necessarily forced him to grow psychologically and to honestly confront his chronic emotional immaturity. Jung explained that often the most transformative and significant relationships are born precisely from these moments of existential crisis in which a person is forced to consciously choose between growing in an evolutionary way or losing something precious forever. The power of detachment, according to Jung, also manifests through what he called meaningful inverse synchronicity. When a person pulls away emotionally from someone who desires them, meaningful coincidences often begin to occur that constantly bring that person into the obsessive thoughts of the one who is losing them. Marco began to see Julia everywhere in his daily reality, to hear songs that intensely reminded him of her, to meet people who spoke to him about topics he associated with their interrupted relationship. It was not an unhealthy pathological obsession, but the natural way in which the unconscious processes the loss of something it had undervalued when it was easily available. Jung observed that the human unconscious has an extraordinary capacity to create meaning and connections even where they apparently do not exist, especially when it is activated by the fear of loss or by regret for wasted opportunities. Julia's detachment had transformed Marco from a person who took her presence for granted into a person obsessed with her meaningful absence. This psychological phenomenon perfectly explains why many people begin to value someone only after having definitively lost them, or after having concretely risked losing them forever. It is not superficiality or emotional immaturity, but a deep unconscious mechanism that Jung called the realization of worth through perceived scarcity. Effective detachment also communicates another extremely powerful unconscious message that Jung identified in his in-depth clinical studies. It tells the other person without words that you are not afraid of solitude, that you have no desperate need for a relationship to feel complete, that you are willing to remain alone rather than accept a mediocre or one-sided connection. This message is particularly powerful because most people have a deep fear of solitude and automatically project this fear onto others. When they meet someone who seems genuinely at ease with their own company, they unconsciously perceive them as superior and more desirable. If this profound message has arrived directly to you at this precise moment of your life, stay a little longer for your own sake. Like the video and subscribe to the channel now. They are small, simple gestures that make this precious space grow together with you and with all the people who seek deep truths about human psychology. Tell me sincerely in the comments which specific part of this message touched you most deeply in the heart. Because when we share from authentic truth, the YouTube algorithm naturally favors what we choose together to explore. Never forget this when you close the video and return to your normal daily life. Detachment is not a strategy to manipulate others, but a way to honor yourself. It is the deep recognition that your worth does not depend on anyone's approval and that you deserve relationships based on conscious choice, not on desperate need.